At 9:23 this morning, inside a closed-door briefing on the fourth floor of the Eisenhower Executive Office building, three senior White House trade advisors went completely silent, not because someone interrupted them, not because a phone rang, but because a transcript had just been placed on the table in front of them, a verbatim account of what Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said publicly, on camera, in front of the entire world. And according to two officials briefed on that moment, one of those advisors read the transcript twice, set it down carefully on the table, and said four words that nobody in that room expected to hear from anyone inside this administration. We may have miscalculated. You need to stop whatever you are doing right now, because what happened in the last 60 minutes is not a diplomatic back and forth. It is not political theater. It is the moment a sitting American president issued a sweeping economic ultimatum to the closest ally this country has ever had and received a response so precise, so methodical, and so devastating in its strategic implications that it has sent a visible tremor through Washington's entire foreign policy and trade establishment. If you care about what happens to the North American economy in the next 30 days, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications because this story is moving faster than anything we have covered this year, and you absolutely cannot afford to miss a single update. The 72 hours ahead of us will determine whether this confrontation stabilizes into a managed dispute or accelerates into something that reshapes the trading relationships this country has depended on for generations. Here is what we know, and I want to be precise about sourcing because the details matter. According to three independent sources, two with direct knowledge of internal White House trade communications and one former senior official at the Office of the United States Trade Representative with ongoing visibility into the current administration's posture, the threat issued by President Trump against Canada's economy this morning was not improvised in front of cameras. It was deliberate, it was sequenced across a multi-week pressure campaign, and it was specifically designed to force a rapid capitulation from a government that people inside the West Wing genuinely and confidently believed would fold within hours of the pressure becoming public. What happened instead has left trade analysts, foreign policy scholars, Republican and Democratic members of Congress alike, and senior figures at multiple international financial institutions struggling to recalibrate everything they thought they understood about where this confrontation was headed and how much leverage Washington actually holds. Multiple people briefed on the Canadian government's internal response tell us that Prime Minister Carney's reply was not reactive. It was not improvised. The language had been stress-tested across multiple scenarios. The economic mathematics underpinning every specific claim had been reviewed at the deputy minister level across three separate federal departments over a period of weeks. What Carney said this morning was not a bluff assembled under pressure. Every word of it reflected completed analytical work. And that is precisely, specifically, what froze the room in the Eisenhower building. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the chronological sequence matters enormously. And every single date in this chain was a deliberate choice by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Approximately 18 months ago, the bilateral relationship between the United States and Canada was functioning, if clearly strained at the edges. Cross-border trade volumes were running at approximately $2.1 trillion annually, making the Canada-US economic corridor the single largest bilateral trading relationship in human history by total dollar value. 40 American states count Canada as their number one or number two export market. More than 800,000 jobs on the American side of the border depend directly on that relationship remaining functional and stable. These are not numbers from Ottawa. These figures come from the United States Chamber of Commerce and from the Congressional Research Service. Keep those numbers in your mind as this story unfolds, because they become important in ways that are not immediately obvious when you first encounter them. Beginning in January of this year, the Trump administration began applying what multiple sources with knowledge of internal deliberations describe as a deliberate, methodical pressure campaign against Canadian trade policy. The campaign targeted three specific areas: Canada's supply management system governing dairy and poultry markets, its digital services tax framework that had repeatedly frustrated American technology companies, and Canada's insistence on retaining certain cultural protection measures that American entertainment and media interests had long sought to eliminate or significantly weaken. The specific demand transmitted through official channels, according to a document reviewed by two of our sources, was not simply about adjusting tariff rates at the margin. It was about a structural change in the bilateral relationship itself. Washington wanted Canada to subordinate several of its domestic regulatory frameworks to approval mechanisms that would give American trade officials practical veto power over Canadian domestic policy decisions before those decisions could take effect. In plain language, the United States was asking Canada to accept a form of regulatory oversight that no sovereign nation in the post-war international system has voluntarily accepted from a trade partner. When that demand was transmitted through official channels in late February, the Carney government did not respond through the usual back-channel diplomatic communications that these situations typically generate. They went quiet. They said almost nothing publicly and nothing privately through the channels Washington was monitoring. And in diplomacy, deliberate silence from a government as experienced and analytically sophisticated as Canada's is never accidental and never without strategic intent. Smash that like button right now if you understand why that silence should have been the first warning sign that Washington chose to ignore entirely. By the morning of March 3rd, that silence had lasted long enough to visibly irritate senior figures in the White House and begin generating concern among normally confident members of the administration's trade team. According to a senior Republican Senate aide who spoke with us on background, there were active internal discussions about whether the Canadian government was simply running out the clock, buying deliberate time on a confrontation. The administration believed it had already strategically and decisively won. The governing assumption inside the White House, and this is the critical element that changes everything about what happened this morning, was that Canada's profound economic dependence on American markets gave Washington essentially unlimited coercive leverage, that Carney, facing his own complicated domestic political environment, and with Canadian businesses anxiously watching the confrontation develop, could not afford to allow a serious trade war to materially damage Canadian households and enterprises heading into a period of significant economic uncertainty. That assumption made complete logical sense on paper. It reflected a reading of the economic relationship that most trade economists in Washington would have considered obviously correct as recently as 6 months ago. It had one catastrophic analytical flaw that nobody in the relevant decision-making positions appears to have fully resolved before the pressure was applied. And we are going to get to exactly what that flaw was in a moment, because it changes the entire meaning of everything that happened this morning. But first, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what I am about to show you is the component of this story that every major outlet is currently missing. You need to understand who Mark Carney actually is, because the media coverage of this confrontation has systematically and fundamentally underestimated him, and that underestimation is itself a significant and revealing part of the story. Carney is not a conventional politician who arrived at his position through the typical sequence of constituency management, party loyalty, and retail electoral positioning. He is one of the genuinely rare individuals in modern international history to have served as governor of two separate G7 central banks, the Bank of Canada from 2008 through 2013, and the Bank of England from 2013 through 2020. He navigated the 2008 global financial crisis at the helm of Canadian monetary policy and received nearly universal professional praise from economists across the ideological spectrum for the precision, the speed, and the measured effectiveness of his interventions during that acute period. He is not a man who responds to economic pressure emotionally or through political instinct alone. He responds to it analytically, with the same systematic risk management framework he brought to crisis management at two of the most consequential financial institutions in the world. And the specific architecture of the threat Trump issued this morning was, according to two economists with direct knowledge of Carney's internal deliberations over recent weeks, almost perfectly calibrated to activate exactly the category of prepared, structured, economically grounded response that Carney had already methodically constructed in anticipation of precisely this scenario. The administration, in the words of one source close to the Canadian government, brought a political argument to an economic mathematician who had been expecting that argument and had already built the response. Here is what Trump's economic threat actually contained, because the specifics matter in ways the available headlines are completely failing to capture. According to official statements and documents reviewed by our team, the the administration threatened a tiered escalation of tariffs on Canadian goods, beginning at 25% on non-energy imports, with an explicit and formally stated threat to extend those tariffs to Canadian energy exports if Ottawa did not comply with a specific package of demands within a defined time window. The threat was issued publicly, with maximum media visibility, clearly structured to generate domestic political pressure on Carney's government at home. The administration's theory of the case was direct and internally coherent. If Canadian consumers and businesses saw serious economic consequences approaching in real time, they would create irresistible domestic political pressure on their own government to reach an accommodation rather than absorb the damage of a prolonged standoff. It is the same pressure campaign logic that has produced results to varying degrees in other trade confrontations this administration has pursued with other partners. Against Canada this week, it has produced something that no serious analyst inside Washington appears to have genuinely and completely modelled in advance. Carney's response arrived in 3 distinct and carefully sequenced parts, and each part was more significant than the one that preceded it. The first part was a direct public statement that Canada would match any American tariff measure with equivalent Canadian tariffs applied to American goods, dollar for dollar, sector for sector, with no exceptions, and no negotiations conducted under what Carney explicitly and repeatedly characterized as conditions of duress and coercion. That first part alone was notable for its directness and its refusal of the usual diplomatic hedging language, but it was not fundamentally surprising to careful observers of the relationship. What was genuinely surprising, what caught senior people off guard, was the second part. Carney announced that Canada was immediately and urgently accelerating trade diversification discussions with the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. He was explicit that this was not a long-term strategic aspiration, being articulated for negotiating leverage. He described it as an active, urgent, present-tense reorientation of Canadian export and investment policy, beginning immediately and moving on a compressed timeline. He cited specific port infrastructure capacity figures on Canada's Pacific and Atlantic coasts. He referenced existing trade agreement frameworks through which alternative market access could be expanded rapidly. He identified specific Canadian export categories: dimensional lumber, primary aluminum, agricultural commodities, processed seafood, and critical minerals, where alternative buyer relationships had already been identified and where preliminary commercial discussions had already quietly begun months before this morning's statement. This was not a negotiating threat about hypothetical future possibilities. This was a presentation of work already substantially underway. And then came the third part, the component that produced the silence in the Eisenhower building, and that I need to make sure you fully understand before we discuss what comes next. Canada sits on the largest accessible reserves of many of the specific minerals that the United States defense establishment and technology sector have formally and explicitly defined as strategically irreplaceable for 21st century military and commercial capability. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earth elements, and a range of additional critical materials. These are the physical building blocks of electric vehicle battery manufacturing, advanced weapons systems guidance and propulsion technology, semiconductor fabrication processes, satellite communications infrastructure, and the entire hardware supply chain underlying artificial intelligence development and deployment. The United States does not have domestic production capacity capable of replacing Canadian supply at industrial scale within any timeline that is relevant to current military readiness planning, technology sector investment cycles, or existing manufacturing commitments and contracts. Carney did not threaten to immediately and abruptly cut off those mineral exports. He did something considerably more precise and strategically sophisticated than a blunt cut-off threat, which would have been easy to dismiss as escalatory and unsustainable. He announced that Canada was conducting an immediate formal review of all critical mineral export arrangements with the United States, and that any new agreements and any renewals of expiring arrangements would be evaluated comprehensively in the context of whether the broader bilateral trade relationship met Canada's standard of genuine reciprocity and mutual respect. In the language of international economic statecraft, this is the equivalent of placing your hand visibly and deliberately on the circuit breaker for the American technology and defense industrial base and stating quietly, with complete professional composure, that you know exactly where the switch is located, and you understand exactly what turning it would affect. Hit that like button right now if you understand why 3 White House trade advisors went silent when they read that transcript this morning, and why the word miscalculated landed in that room the way it did. Now here is where this becomes significantly more complicated, and I need you to stay with me through this section, because the implications extend far beyond this single bilateral confrontation, reach into questions about American strategic positioning that go well beyond trade policy. The Biden administration spent 3 years and tens of billions of dollars attempting to build out domestic American supply chains for critical minerals, with progress that most honest analysts would describe as meaningful but structurally insufficient for the near-term requirements of American defense and technology sectors. The CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the multiple executive orders around strategic resource security and allied nation friendshoring, all of them contain substantial and documented dependencies on Canadian supply during the years-long transition period before domestic and alternative source alternatives can scale to required industrial production levels. The Trump administration inherited those dependencies intact. They are real, they are significant in dollar terms, and they are not resolvable through executive action on a politically convenient timeline. According to a defense industry source with direct visibility into Pentagon supply chain planning processes, there is currently no 18-month solution to the critical mineral vulnerability that Carney placed formally and publicly on the table this morning. There is no 12-month solution available. The leverage calculation that Washington constructed, that economic dependence in the bilateral relationship runs overwhelmingly and irreversibly one direction, was not wrong about the aggregate trade picture. It was critically and consequentially incomplete about the specific sub-relationships where the dependencies run the other way, where American vulnerability is real, and where Canadian decision-making authority over the pace and terms of any resolution is substantially greater than the administration's strategic posture acknowledged. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications right now, because the next development in this situation may arrive before this video finishes circulating, and I will bring you the analysis the moment it breaks. Let me bring all of this together into the scenario framework, because this is where precise and honest thinking matters most. There are 3 plausible trajectories for this confrontation, and I have assessed each of them as carefully and honestly as the available information permits. The first scenario, which I assess at roughly 30 to 35% probability, is a managed de-escalation in which quiet back-channel contacts between senior trade officials on both sides produce a face-saving framework within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Both governments announce a negotiating process. Language is carefully constructed to allow each leader to claim domestic political credibility. The most severe threatened tariff measures are suspended pending structured talks, and the confrontation recedes from immediate crisis mode into the slower rhythm of extended trade diplomacy. This is the scenario that financial markets appear to be pricing as most likely, and I think markets are reflecting a degree of optimism that the specific details of this morning's exchange and the depth of preparation evident in Carney's response do not fully support. The second scenario, which I assess at approximately 40% probability, is a sustained standoff in which both governments maintain their public positions while tariffs take effect. Canadian retaliatory measures are applied to specific American sectors chosen with clear political awareness of their sensitivity in swing states, and the confrontation becomes embedded as a persistent feature of North American economic reality for the remainder of this year and potentially into the next. In this scenario, the economic damage is real, measurable, and unevenly distributed across American states and industries, with the political pressure to resolve the standoff building gradually through economic rather than diplomatic channels. The third scenario, which I assess at roughly 25%, and which is receiving almost no serious public attention in Washington right now, is the one that experienced trade economists find most alarming. It is the scenario in which Canada's diversification pivot moves faster than Washington anticipates. Commercial partners in Europe and Asia respond with genuine urgency to Canadian outreach because they have their own strong strategic reasons to welcome a reorientation of Canadian supply relationships away from exclusive American dependence, and the window for fully restoring the pre-crisis bilateral relationship closes not through any dramatic rupture, but through the quiet, methodical, cumulative rerouting of Canadian trade and investment flows that eventually become structurally very difficult to reverse. This is not the dramatic scenario. It produces no single defining headline moment. It is the scenario where 12 or 18 months from now, American policymakers and American businesses discover that leverage they assumed they held permanently has been quietly and irreversibly reduced through thousands of individual commercial and investment decisions that collectively and permanently changed the architecture of North American economic integration. Drop a comment right now. Which of those three scenarios do you think unfolds from here? I have been following this bilateral relationship closely, and I genuinely want to know what you are seeing from your position, in your industry, in your state. The view from Washington is never the complete picture, and what you are observing on the ground is real information. Here is the broader significance I need you to carry beyond this video. What happened this morning is not simply a trade dispute between neighboring countries that share the longest undefended border in the world and 200 years of deeply integrated economic history. It is a real-time stress test of a strategic assumption that has governed American foreign economic policy for the better part of 3 decades. The assumption that the depth of other nations' dependence on American markets constitutes a form of durable and essentially permanent leverage that those nations cannot effectively counter without catastrophic self-harm. Canada demonstrated this morning in public, with specific numbers and specific timelines and a specific minerals card placed with deliberate and professional visibility on the diplomatic table, that this assumption has expiration conditions, that a government with sufficient preparation time, sufficient analytical sophistication, and sufficient political will can begin to restructure the terms of its economic exposure in ways that are neither painless nor instantaneous, but are critically achievable within a planning horizon that matters to current decision-makers on both sides. Every government watching this confrontation in Berlin, in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Canberra, in capitals across the Western Hemisphere, is taking careful and detailed notes today. The message being received is not that America can be challenged without consequence. The message is that the cost and the difficulty of a strategic economic reorientation away from exclusive American dependence may be more calculable and more survivable than Washington's long-standing posture has assumed or communicated to its partners. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the next 72 hours are going to determine whether private diplomatic contact produces the first meaningful signals of de-escalation, or whether both governments harden their positions into the sustained standoff that market optimism is currently underpricing. I will be here with the analysis the moment developments break. I will give you the context before the competing narratives arrive to shape what you think about what happened. And the question I want to leave you with, the question that deserves your serious and considered answer in the comments below, is this. Is what Mark Carney did this morning the opening move of a fundamentally new model for how America's closest allies respond to economic pressure from Washington? Or is this a singular moment produced by unique personalities and unique circumstances that resolves quietly and changes nothing permanent about the strategic landscape? Because the evidence we walked through together today points in a clear direction, and I think you already know which one it is.